We are not asking for permission to exist. We are asking the world to respect the fact that we already do.
President Ibrahim Traoré. What happens when your passport is denied, but your minerals are demanded? When your students are turned away, but your cobalt is welcomed? For years, African nations were told the gates to opportunity were just a visa away until those gates began to close. In 2025, the United States implemented new travel restrictions on several African countries, citing administrative concerns. But to many, it felt like something deeper, a refusal to see African citizens as equals. Nigeria responded not with protest, but with policy. No entry, no minerals. They said a move that sent shockwaves through global supply chains. This isn't just about visas. It's about value, who gets to cross borders and who gets to build the future. And at the heart of it stands a new Africa confident cooperative and no longer silent. If you've ever believed in fairness, in dignity, in the power of standing tall without standing alone, stay with us, because what you're about to hear won't make the evening news. For decades, the world spoke of globalization as if it were a shared invitation, a promise that talent, ideas, and opportunity would flow freely across continents. But in practice, it often moved in one direction. Resources out of Africa, restrictions in return. Across African airports, travelers with valid documents were often delayed, denied, or heavily scrutinized. Meanwhile, cargo planes filled with rare earth minerals, oil, and agricultural exports left those same runways with ease. For every flight that took Africa's wealth abroad, how many scholars, entrepreneurs, and artists were grounded by bureaucracy? The policy shift in 2025, where the United States tightened visa access for several African countries, wasn't unprecedented, but its timing raised eyebrows. These restrictions arrived just as Africa's global economic influence began to rise, with nations like Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and Mali gaining confidence in trade negotiations and resource management. To many, the message was clear. Opportunity was welcome, but only when it traveled in the right direction. Yet what made this moment historic wasn't the restriction itself, but the response that followed. Nigeria, one of Africa's most resource-rich and populous nations, refused to accept a one-sided exchange. If its citizens could not move freely, neither would its minerals. This marked a turning point. No longer would visa policy be seen as a bureaucratic detail. It had become a mirror reflecting global imbalance. Behind that mirror lies a deeper question. What does equality look like in a world where goods cross borders more easily than the people who produce them? For the older generation watching from Detroit, Atlanta, or Selma, that question may sound familiar. Trade without justice, access without respect, and history repeating not in headlines, but in quiet policies and overlooked patterns. Africa is no longer asking to be included in the global future. It is shaping that future and reshaping the terms of engagement. In early 2025, Nigeria made a decision that would echo far beyond its borders. In response to new U.S. travel restrictions targeting several African nations, the Nigerian government issued a statement that was simple, measured, and quietly historic. If our people are not welcome at your borders, our minerals will not cross yours. It was not a threat. It was a reflection of growing frustration and a demand for mutual respect. At first, it sounded symbolic, but it wasn't. Days later, Nigeria announced a formal review of all foreign mining and export licenses involving key minerals, lithium, cobalt, coltan, and rare earth elements, the very building blocks of electric vehicles, smartphones, military satellites, and AI servers. Within weeks, new export regulations were drafted. By April, several shipments were held at Lagos and Port Harcourt pending review. This wasn't just about minerals. It was about meaning. For years, the world relied on African soil to power its future clean energy, defense technology, and digital transformation. But access to that soil and to the people who live upon it remained unequal. Resources flowed out. Opportunity didn't always flow in. U.S. officials expressed concern. Western companies warned of disruption. But for many Africans, it wasn't disruption. It was dignity. Nigeria's statement, "No entry, no minerals," was more than a policy shift. It was a redefinition of diplomacy. For the first time in recent memory, a major African economy linked access to its resources with respect for its citizens. The message was quiet, but unmistakable. The future will not be built on double standards. Meanwhile, markets took notice. Lithium prices ticked up. Manufacturing projections in Europe and North America were revised. Investors scrambled to assess risk. But the most important response didn't come from Wall Street. It came from the streets of Accra, Johannesburg, Bamako, where citizens saw for the first time what resource sovereignty might actually look like. This wasn't a revolution of force. It was a revolution of terms. And it didn't happen in isolation. Nigeria was simply the latest to draw a line. Months earlier, Burkina Faso had declared that foreign mining contracts would be renegotiated to serve public needs before foreign profits. Ibrahim Traoré, the country's transitional leader, had traveled village to village, reaffirming that gold and uranium would no longer leave the country without the people benefiting first. In Mali, mining audits exposed long-standing disparities in export royalties. In Niger, uranium contracts, once quietly extended, were put under national review. These weren't isolated cases. They were signals. A continent once viewed as a source of raw material was reclaiming its role as a stakeholder in global production, not just through policies, but through principle. And yet, the questions lingered. Was Nigeria jeopardizing trade? Was it risking investment? Could this stance backfire? But ask a Nigerian entrepreneur whose visa has been denied 5 times. Ask a university student whose scholarship was canceled due to administrative delays. Ask a grandmother who sends her savings to a grandchild in Boston, only to hear that the embassy didn't process the paperwork. They don't see a risky move. They see a necessary one. For years, Africa was told to be patient, to wait its turn, to play by rules written elsewhere. But patience, like any resource, runs out when not reciprocated. The world needs Nigeria's minerals, but Nigeria also needs to be seen, not just mined. Dignity is not a favor. It's a foundation. By mid-2025, several African nations began quietly discussing similar moves. Ghana initiated a cross-ministerial review of visa reciprocity policies. The African Union called for a summit on equitable mobility, and youth movements across the continent began using a new phrase: "If you limit our people, we limit your pipelines." This isn't a story of anger. It's a story of awakening. And while headlines may focus on trade negotiations or stock volatility, the deeper shift is cultural. A generation is rising, one that sees value not just in what Africa has, but in who Africa is. No entry, no minerals. It may sound firm, but at its heart, it's a question dressed as a statement. If we are truly partners, why are our passports not treated the same? The term supply chain often sounds cold, technical, a web of logistics and contracts of ports and percentages. But behind every container of lithium, every barrel of oil, every shipment of rare earths, lies something more: human history, labor, and choice. When Nigeria said, "No minerals without mobility," the world was caught off guard. But the deeper surprise wasn't what Nigeria did. It was the realization that it could do it. For years, the global system treated Africa as replaceable. If one nation pushed back, the assumption was that another would step in. But something has changed. That assumption is no longer safe. Burkina Faso, under the leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, had already begun charting a new course. In 2024, it revoked several foreign mining licenses, citing environmental neglect and unfair profit sharing. The move was met with resistance, but not regret. Local communities, for the first time in decades, saw direct benefits from gold and phosphate extraction. Clinics were built, roads were repaired, and trust began to grow. In Niger, uranium had long powered European homes, while many Nigerian villages lacked electricity. But in 2025, the government initiated a full review of all contracts with foreign energy firms. In a televised address, the president said, "If what's beneath our feet can light cities across the ocean, then surely it can light our own schools first." These were not empty declarations. These were rebalancing acts long overdue. Western observers often viewed Africa's resource wealth as a problem of mismanagement. But the truth exposed in this new wave of policy shifts is that mismanagement often flowed both ways. Contracts were signed under pressure, profits flowed outward, and when governments tried to renegotiate, they faced threats of downgrades, sanctions, or diplomatic pushback. Nigeria's recent stand, though, focused on visas, revealed just how entangled everything had become. A visa policy here, a mine shut down there, a shipping delay over there. What emerged wasn't chaos, but clarity, mobility, resources, and dignity were all connected. And now, younger Africans are connecting those dots. On university campuses in Ghana, students launched a campaign called Passport Justice, demanding fair treatment in international travel agreements. In Kenya, tech entrepreneurs began calling for talent corridors, linking innovation to immigration rights. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where Colton fuels the global smartphone industry, a coalition of youth leaders began documenting the labor conditions behind the supply chain, not as protest, but as accountability. Africa, long seen as a silent partner, is beginning to speak, and in that voice is a question the world cannot ignore. What happens when the producers of your prosperity begin asking for parity? Some media outlets framed this as a geopolitical crisis. Others warned of strategic realignment. But the truth is simpler. What's unfolding is not a rupture, it's a reckoning. Because the supply chain was never neutral. It was built on choices about who benefits and who waits. And when those at the beginning of the chain decide to stand up, the whole system feels the shift. In Washington, conversations began to shift. Some policymakers called for deeper engagement with African nations built on shared interests. But among African analysts, that language felt familiar and insufficient. Because interest without equity is not partnership. It's policy without principle. And in the background, new players moved in. Turkey began negotiating agricultural modernization deals with Burkina Faso. China offered transport infrastructure loans to Mali without conditions on visa policy. India launched a scholarship program for African students, offering visa-free access for STEM programs. The message was clear: if some doors closed, others were opening. But perhaps the most revealing development came not from any capital, but from online. On platforms like TikTok and X, young Africans began remixing a quote from President Ibrahim Traoré. "They told us our borders were sacred, but only when we tried to cross them." That line spread like wildfire, not as rebellion, but as reflection. Because beneath every visa denial, beneath every stalled trade deal, lies a truth that many have known for years. Systems are not just made of rules. They're made of respect. And respect, like minerals, must be earned, not extracted. Diplomacy rarely makes headlines until it disrupts what people take for granted. In the weeks after Nigeria's policy shift, headlines shifted from visa debates to something more urgent: supply shortages, price hikes, and industry uncertainty. Automakers in the US and Europe raised quiet alarms. The lithium used in batteries wasn't moving as quickly. Electronics companies adjusted shipping forecasts, and in global meetings, phrases like supply chain resilience reappeared: coded language for one thing. Africa had acted, and the world hadn't anticipated it. But the biggest consequence wasn't economic, it was symbolic. For decades, African nations were expected to be partners, but on terms set elsewhere. Diplomats spoke of collaboration, but policy often arrived unilaterally. Decisions made in Paris or Washington would ripple across Lagos, Accra, Bamako, often without warning, without consultation. Now the ripple was moving in reverse. When Nigeria linked mobility to minerals, it wasn't just resetting a policy. It was resetting a tone. Soon other African leaders began responding, not with statements, but with silence, a strategic silence. Some paused contract renewals. Others began reevaluating development loans. Quiet meetings turned into quiet messages. Africa is watching. In Western capitals, the tone shifted. Some leaders called for more engagement. Others questioned how such a powerful reaction came from something as simple as a visa list. But to African citizens, it was never just a list. It was a mirror, a reflection of how little their movement, their talent, their presence was valued, even as their resources remained essential. And that disconnect created a spark. In Ghana, civil society groups held forums titled Borders and Burdens. In South Africa, university panels explored the links between visa regimes and post-colonial trade. In the diaspora from Chicago to London, African professionals began speaking out, not in anger, but in clarity. They asked a question too long ignored. If our labor builds your systems, why can't our children study in your schools? The consequences, in truth, were not designed to punish. They were designed to pause, to force a moment of reflection. Because the future of global cooperation cannot be built on one-way doors. And as new partnerships emerged with BRICS nations, with regional African unions, with Asia and South America, the balance began to shift, not away from the West, but toward fairness. Fairness that said we trade, but we also travel, we contribute, and we belong. In this moment, the most powerful statement wasn't a headline. It was a new diplomatic posture, upright, collaborative, and clear. We're open to partnership, but not to policy that forgets we are people too. And in that clarity, something changed. Africa was no longer asking to be seen. It was showing the world what happens when it's finally heard. For observers unfamiliar with Africa's internal transformation, Nigeria's stand may have seemed reactive, a bold yet isolated act of nationalism. But look closer, and another picture emerges. This wasn't isolation. It was alignment. What happened in Abuja was not born in a vacuum. It followed months of coordinated action across the Sahel and West Africa, a strategic recalibration led not by crisis, but by consciousness. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré had already redrawn the lines of engagement. His administration prioritized national control of mineral wealth transparency in contract renegotiation and partnerships that emphasized mutual benefit. The message was not anti-West, it was pro-sovereignty. Mali under Colonel Assimi Goïta took similar steps, ending certain military arrangements, auditing resource flows, and investing in regional infrastructure that connected African economies to one another instead of to ports controlled by former colonial powers. Niger, holding one of the world's largest uranium reserves, stunned observers by placing operations previously managed by foreign firms under national supervision. And in doing so, it questioned a decades-long assumption that Africa would always choose stability over equity. Now the momentum was moving. What Nigeria initiated the link between mobility and minerals, gave a name to something Africans across the continent had long felt that dignity is indivisible. If a student cannot cross a border but a shipment of lithium can, what does that say about the system? It says the system values what Africa has not, who Africa is. But 2025 became the year that changed. What began as a visa policy clash soon became a catalyst. African leaders began consulting across borders. Economists drafted models for regional currency options. Infrastructure ministers met not just with foreign investors, but with one another. This was the real shift, the one beneath the headlines. Africa wasn't rejecting globalization. It was redefining it. Rather than waiting for aid packages or development deals, countries like Burkina Faso, Ghana, Nigeria, and even Congo began crafting African-to-African investment agreements. A solar energy partnership between Ghana and Burkina Faso bypassed Western intermediaries altogether. A new freight corridor connecting Mali's interior to coastal markets avoided legacy shipping bottlenecks. And while old power centers watched cautiously, new alliances quietly expanded. Turkey and China offered dual-use infrastructure roads that served both trade and domestic development. India proposed student exchange programs that didn't discriminate by nationality. Brazil reopened agricultural research programs with East African universities. What was forming was not a new bloc, but a new balance, not anti-anyone, but aligned with African interest first. From a strategic perspective, this moment wasn't just about minerals or movement. It was about memory. African leaders remember when aid came with fine print, when partnerships meant dependency, and when reforms were another name for foreign approval. Now the language is changing. Words like equity, mutual respect, and reciprocity are replacing older phrases like stability and assistance. And to many across the continent, that change is not just strategic, it's generational. A young graduate in Nairobi no longer looks to Paris for validation. A cocoa farmer in Ghana doesn't need permission to trade directly with a neighbor. A policy advisor in Abuja can build models not on advice from abroad, but on case studies from within the continent. This isn't a rupture, it's a reset, and it's one that's already influencing global positioning. Western think tanks are beginning to recommend deeper listening, not louder messaging. Trade delegations are arriving with fewer conditions and more curiosity. And even in the United Nations, conversations about structural reform are being taken more seriously, not out of charity, but out of necessity. Because when Africa moves together, the world cannot afford to move without it. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all. The strategic strength of Nigeria's stand was not in its volume, but in its vision, a vision already shared across Sahel alliances, West African markets, and growing coalitions across the global South. A vision that said, we will not build our future with borrowed blueprints. We will draft our own. And those who wish to build with us, not above us, are welcome. Title: If Borders Divide Us, Let Dignity Unite Us. There's a question that lingers after all the policy debates, the trade statistics, the diplomatic statements. And it's not about minerals. It's not even about visas. It's about worth. What is a nation worth when it's seen only through the lens of what it can offer, not who it is? Nigeria asked that question in 2025, and in doing so, held up a mirror not just to its partners abroad, but to an entire system. A system that often moves goods faster than it moves grace. That opens markets, but not minds. That accepts resources, but hesitates with respect. But this moment, this stand, gave all of us something rare clarity. It showed that dignity is not a bargaining chip. It's a starting point, and for those watching from afar, from Chicago to Charleston, from Seattle to St. Louis, this isn't a story about Africa alone. It's about what partnership should mean anywhere. It's about remembering that fair treatment isn't earned through compliance. It's confirmed through compassion. So if this story moves you not out of pity, but out of principle, share it. Share it with those who still believe that justice shouldn't need a visa. Because if you've ever marched for fairness, ever spoken for the unseen, or ever wondered what solidarity looks like in this century, now you know. Africa is speaking. And this time, it's not asking, it's inviting.